"I've found the perfect place for you," Sabrina said with that polished smile she used for real estate agents and wedding photographers. "They even have painting classes and ocean views." Her voice was syrupy sweet, almost rehearsed like she had practiced in front of a mirror. The restaurant smelled of garlic butter and deceit. Ethan sat beside her nodding like he was auditioning for Most Dutiful Son of the Year. In front of me lay glossy brochures filled with pictures of smiling seniors holding hands painting sunsets that looked too perfect to be real. I smiled, pretending to be touched my fingers, brushing the edge of the shiny paper. Inside my stomach turned to ice. Because last night I'd seen a text flash across Ethan's phone when he thought I was asleep. "Once she's settled, we can list the house next week." That house wasn't just a building. It was my entire life, 40 years of teaching, saving, and surviving, and now my own children were planning to bury me alive in comfort and call it love. The table sparkled under warm light, every detail staged to look like affection. The linen was white, the crystal glasses flawless, the music soft and elegant. Sabrina reached for my hand, her diamond ring flashing like a warning. "You deserve the best, Mom." Golden Shore Residence is luxury retirement, private balconies, a therapy pool, gourmet dining. "You'll be safe and cared for." She said safe like I was a broken toy that needed locking away. Ethan cleared his throat, trying to sound sincere. "We just want you to rest, Mom. You've done so much for us." His eyes didn't meet mine. He stared at the silverware, tapping his thumb against the fork in rhythm with his nerves. I could almost hear his mind whispering numbers, mortgage payments, bank balances, equity. "Golden Shore," I repeated, flipping through the brochure. A smiling woman my age was knitting by a window. Another was painting flowers. "Elder care with dignity," the tagline read. My lips curled into something that might have looked like a smile. "It does look peaceful." Sabrina leaned forward eagerly. "Exactly. You won't have to worry about bills, repairs, or confusion. They handle everything, Dr. Pierce said. Environments like this are perfect for seniors who need routine." I raised an eyebrow. "Routine." She hesitated just a second too long. "You know, structure. A controlled schedule helps people your age feel safe." People your age. As if 71 had turned me into another species. I looked at her smooth skin, her perfect hair, and thought of all the nights I'd stayed up grading papers, so Ethan could have a decent home, a piano and braces. I wondered when love had turned into calculation. "I appreciate your concern," I said softly. "You've both done so much planning." Ethan smiled, relieved. Sabrina reached for her purse, sliding out a folder. "Just some basic authorizations," she said lightly. "The center needs a signature before we reserve your suite." A waitress arrived with the check. Sabrina took it before I could reach. "Our treat, Mom." "You deserve this." "Oh, I do," I said, tucking the folder into my bag. "More than you know." After dinner, I stood outside under the glow of streetlights. The Savannah night smelled of wet magnolia and distant sea air. Sabrina kissed my cheek, her perfume too sweet clinging. "You'll love it there," she said. "You can paint, take walks, make friends. It'll be perfect." I nodded slowly. "Perfect," I repeated, watching her slide her manicured hand into Ethan's arm. They walked toward their car, laughing, young Shore invincible. I waited until they were gone before I let the smile drop. The next morning, sunlight spilled across my kitchen, quiet and clean. The brochure sat on the counter beside my tea, the smiling seniors staring back at me. "Where your loved ones rest easy," the caption said. I traced the words with my finger. Rest easy. That was what they wanted for me to rest while they took everything I had built. My reflection in the window looked foreign hair, graying hands lined with time, but eyes sharp as ever. I'd been underestimated before by bosses, by banks, by men who thought a school teacher couldn't manage investments. Each time I proved them wrong. This would be no different. The phone rang. Ethan's voice was cheerful. "Morning, Mom." Sabrina and I talked to the coordinator. "They can do the move this weekend." "So soon?" "Yeah, it's better to settle things before the holidays. You won't have to deal with stress." I looked at the stack of mail on the table, the property tax notice with my name bold at the top. "You're right," I said. "No stress. Just sign those papers when you get a chance," he added. "We'll handle the rest." "I'm sure you will," I murmured and hung up. For a long while I stood there listening to the clock tick. On the wall hung a photo of Thomas, my late husband, taken in front of this very house the year we paid it off. His handwriting still marked the back of the frame. "Never let them take what you built." I opened the drawer, pulled out the folder Sabrina had handed me, and flipped through the papers. The language was polished but unmistakable: transfer of authority, estate management, limited power of attorney. My pulse slowed. So this was how love wrote its farewell. I poured a cup of tea and carried it to the porch. Outside, the wind rustled the oak, scattering leaves like pieces of memory. I thought of the last day I'd walked my students to the bus stop, how one of them had said, "You're the only teacher who listens." That was decades ago, but the words returned now, soft as prayer. They thought I wouldn't notice the signatures, the dates, the convenient timing. They thought the years had dulled my mind. But age doesn't make you weak, it makes you careful. And I was going to be very, very careful. That night, I heard them again, Ethan's voice low, Sabrina's sharper, slicing through the air of my hallway. They must have thought I was asleep. "The realtor says we can get 650, maybe 7, Sabrina whispered. "Once she's moved, I'll stage the house myself." "And the account?" Ethan asked. "Already drafted. When she signs the new authorization, it's done." I stood in the dark, heart pounding but steady. The tea on the nightstand had gone cold, untouched. I turned toward the window, the moonlight sliding across my hand. So that was their plan. To tuck me away with knitting needles while they carved up my life like vultures over a feast. I breathed in long and slow. The betrayal hurt less than the clarity. They weren't monsters. They were simply what greed made of love. In the morning, I brewed coffee and folded laundry as if nothing had changed. Sabrina would be dropping by later with more forms. I'd sign what she gave me, just not the way she expected. For now, I smiled at my reflection again, practicing the act I'd need to play perfectly. The confused old lady, the fragile mother, the woman too tired to fight. They wanted to believe I was fading. I would let them. I looked down at the brochure one last time, the caption shining under the kitchen light: "Golden Shore, where your loved ones rest easy." "Rest easy," I whispered, sliding the paper into the trash. "Not yet." The whisper came through the hallway at midnight. "The lawyer said she just has to sign the update, then we can move forward," Sabrina murmured, her voice low and calculating. "She won't even notice," Ethan replied. Her hands shake too much to read anything. I stood barefoot behind my bedroom door, the wood cool against my palm, my heart beating a slow, deliberate rhythm. Every word slid under that door like a blade. They were talking about my will, not about my comfort, not about my health, my will. The same document Thomas and I had signed 30 years ago, promising that our home, the one we built board by board, would always stay in the family. I had taught hundreds of students about honesty and respect, only to raise 2 adults who spoke about me like a liability. I listened as they poured wine in my kitchen, laughing softly. The betrayal sounded like glasses clinking. "The notary can meet us next week," Sabrina said. "Once she signs, we'll have everything in place before she transitions." Transitions. The word landed like acid. I imagined her rehearsing it in front of a mirror, smoothing her hair while plotting my erasure. Ethan hesitated. "Are you sure this is right?" "Don't start that," she snapped. "We're not hurting her. We're managing what she can't. You said it yourself, she's been forgetting things." "Forgetting?" I pressed my forehead to the door. That one lie repeated enough times would turn me into a ghost before I was dead. They left an hour later, doors closing softly, their voices fading into the dark. I waited until silence was complete before stepping out. The air smelled of Merlot and betrayal. The folder they'd left on the counter glowed faintly under the kitchen light. I picked it up, scanning the papers: authorization, transfers, power of attorney, bank access. Legal theft printed on fine paper. I slid the documents back exactly as they were and wiped my fingerprints from the counter. Upstairs, I opened the old cedar chest where Thomas had kept his teaching supplies. Beneath a stack of lesson plans was a small lockbox containing our original will house deed and the savings certificates I'd tucked away years ago. Everything was still there, safe. I photographed each page with my phone and slipped the USB drive from my drawer into the box. My husband's handwriting on the label read Investment Records 1987-2001. Thomas had always believed in preparing for storms. If the world ever turns against you, he used to say, make sure it finds you ready. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching the papers, the memories, the years. They thought I was confused. They thought I was too old to notice the smell of deceit. That morning, Sabrina arrived early with croissants and a rehearsed smile. "Morning, Mom. Thought you could use breakfast." "You didn't forget we're meeting the consultant, did you?" I rubbed my temples, feigning fatigue. "The consultant, yes, from Golden Shore," she said cheerfully. "She's just going to ask you a few questions, simple stuff. Memory, mobility, preferences. Nothing stressful." I let my shoulders sag. "Oh goodness, I hope I remember what day it is." Sabrina laughed a little too loud. "See? That's exactly why this place will be perfect for you. Structure helps." When she went to pour coffee, I slipped my phone into my sleeve and tapped the record button. The small red light blinked, once catching her voice as she hummed. "Here," she said, handing me a pen and sliding a paper across the table. "They'll need your signature for the initial evaluation." "What's this?" I asked, pretending to squint. "Oh, just consent for the assessment," she said quickly. The title said Pre-Authorization for Transfer of Assets. I smiled faintly, pen poised. "And this helps the retirement home." "Yes," she said too fast. My pen touched the paper, and for a moment I imagined her relief as ink filled the signature line. Then I stopped. "You know, dear, I think I'll wait until Ethan comes. My mind's not what it used to be." Her jaw tightened, but she kept the smile. "Of course, Mom. Whatever makes you comfortable." When she left, I locked the papers away. The recording on my phone captured everything: her tone, her lies, even the pause when she realized I wasn't as gullible as she hoped. That afternoon, I drove to the small cafe by the river one Thomas and I used to visit every spring. Ruth Jenkins was already there, waiting with her usual black coffee. Her hair was silver now, but her eyes were still courtroom sharp. "Dorothy Miles," she said, setting down her cup. "You only call me when someone's in trouble." "Who is it this time?" "My family," I said simply. She listened as I explained, never interrupting, her expression hardening like granite. When I finished, she said quietly, "That's not family. That's fraud." I nodded. "They think I'm too old to fight." Ruth smiled thinly. "Then they've forgotten who taught me how." She opened her briefcase and slid a card across the table. "Leonard Burke, attorney at law, elder protection and estate defense. He's retired but brilliant," she said. "He'll help you protect everything." I looked out the window at the slow river, sunlight breaking through clouds. "I don't want them arrested, Ruth. I just want them to learn. Justice isn't always about jail time," she said. "Sometimes it's about reminding people you're not an easy target." Before I left, she squeezed my hand. "Whatever you do, do it fast. People like Sabrina move quick when they smell money." That night I prepared. I withdrew $20,000 from a private account Thomas had opened decades ago, the one even Ethan didn't know existed. I copied my will, stored it in a waterproof envelope, and hid it beneath the loose floorboard in the closet. Then I sat at my desk and wrote 2 letters, one for Ruth, one for myself. "If anything happens to me, the truth is in the lockbox." Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the window like a ticking clock. I went to the kitchen and found the tea set Sabrina had brought me last Christmas. It was beautiful porcelain white with blue flowers, but tonight it tasted bitter. I poured a cup, pretended to sip, then poured the rest into the sink. Later I heard the back door creak open. Soft voices. Sabrina's whisper floated through the house. "She'll sign tomorrow." I added the sedatives to her tea. "Just a little, it'll help her relax." Ethan's reply came hesitant. "You said that last time." She didn't even seem sleepy. "Then I'll make sure she drinks it all this time," Sabrina hissed. "By the weekend, we'll have control of everything." My fingers tightened around the doorframe. Every word felt like glass in my lungs. I waited until their footsteps retreated, until the sound of their car faded down the street. Then I went to the sink, looked at the half-empty cup, and smiled. "You'll need more than tea to put me to sleep," I whispered. I took the cup, washed it clean, and dried it carefully. Then I wrote a note to myself on a small card. "Don't drink what they pour. Don't trust what they promise." When I slid it into my wallet, I noticed my reflection in the window again. The lines on my face were sharp, defiant. I didn't look like someone who was fading. I looked like someone who was planning. Before going to bed, I whispered into the quiet house, "Thomas, they think I'm old. They think I'm done. But they've forgotten who built this empire." The next morning, the phone rang again. Sabrina's voice was bright and cheerful. "Morning, Mom. We'll come by later to talk about the move. I think it's time." "Yes," I said calmly, glancing at the sealed envelope on my desk. "It is time." When I hung up, I opened my planner and circled a date 3 days ahead. Under it, I wrote one word: disappear. When morning came, the air smelled of rain and something ending. Sabrina knocked on my bedroom door, her voice bright and falsely warm. "Mom, you up? We're going to the retirement home today." I didn't answer. Downstairs, the kettle was still warm, and the house looked lived in, but I was gone. On the kitchen table beside the glossy brochures for Golden Shore sat a single folded note. "Enjoy the perfect place." By the time Sabrina screamed my name, I was already 50 miles away, driving through the gray dawn of Georgia, leaving behind everything except my self-respect. The highway stretched long and empty, the windshield streaked with drizzle. Every mile between me and Savannah felt like a year I was reclaiming. I wore Thomas's old jacket, the one that still smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Inside my purse were only essentials, passport, jewelry, cash, and the keys to the lockbox holding the truth. I didn't cry, not once. Tears were for grief. This was clarity. 3 hours later, I reached Macon, a sleepy city halfway between who I used to be and who I was becoming. I parked behind a small diner and changed into simple clothes, a gray cardigan and sneakers. No one gave me a second glance when I walked in and ordered black coffee. The waitress smiled, calling me sweetheart. It had been a long time since anyone said that without pity. I opened my phone, the new prepaid one Ruth had helped me set up, and sent a single text to her safe. "It's time," she replied minutes later. "Go to Charleston. Edisto Beach House is ready. Leonard's waiting." I smiled. That house, our secret. Thomas had bought it 40 years ago as an investment and left it under my maiden name, Dorothy Green. I had nearly forgotten about it until Ruth mentioned it in passing. Sabrina and Ethan would never find it. They didn't even know it existed. Outside, the rain stopped. I paid the bill and headed for the bus terminal. At the counter, I bought a one-way ticket to Charleston. "Just visiting family," I said when the clerk asked if I needed a return. "They don't know I'm coming." The woman laughed softly. Best kind of surprise. If only she knew. On the ride north, I watched pine trees blur past their branches, bending under the wind. For the first time in months, my lungs felt full. The air was mine again. By noon, Sabrina and Ethan would have discovered the note. I could almost hear her voice shrill with panic. "Where is she? What did she do?" Ethan would call the police, report me as a missing senior. They'd pretend to be worried to build their story of my confusion. But I wasn't lost. I was gone on purpose. At a small rest stop outside Charleston, I bought a notebook and began writing, not to anyone but to myself. They underestimated me. They always have. I faked confusion, they called it age. I faked weakness, they called it decline. But this will be their lesson. I arrived in Charleston as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the city gold. The taxi driver was an older man with kind eyes who hummed jazz as he drove. "Edisto Beach?" he asked when I gave him the address. "Bit quiet out there." "That's exactly what I need," I said. As we left the city, the air grew heavy with salt. The ocean appeared like a bruise of blue against the fading light. When the taxi turned onto a narrow lane lined with dunes, I recognized the small yellow cottage immediately. The shutters were faded green, the porch sagging slightly, but it still stood defiant against years of wind. Thomas's voice came back to me, warm and certain. "If the world ever turns against you, come here. This place will remember you when people don't." I paid the driver and carried my small suitcase up the steps. The key fit perfectly, turning with a soft click. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and salt. Sheets still covered the furniture, ghosts waiting to be uncovered. I removed them one by one, revealing a small kitchen, a cozy sitting room, and a bookshelf lined with Thomas's old books. On the counter sat a note, written in faded ink, "Never let them take what you built." I pressed the paper to my heart. "I didn't," I whispered. "I never will." I unpacked quietly. The house creaked like an old friend stretching after a long sleep. Every board, every nail held a memory. At dusk, there was a knock on the door. My pulse quickened, but when I opened it, Ruth stood there, her silver hair glinting in the fading light. "I knew you'd come," she said, simply. I hugged her hard. I thought I was ready for this. "Turns out freedom is heavier than I remembered." She smiled. "It gets lighter once you fill it with purpose." Inside we made tea and sat at the small table. The sound of waves filtered through the open window. Ruth spread a folder before me, legal documents, financial audits, evidence trails. "Leonard's been working quietly. Sabrina tried to access your main account again this morning. The bank froze everything." "Good," I said. Let her taste uncertainty. Ruth's gaze softened. "What's next? I want them to see what I've built," I said slowly. "I want them to see what I've become without them." She nodded, sliding another envelope across the table. "Leonard's number. He's waiting for your call. He knows what to do." We talked long into the night. When Ruth finally left, the stars had come out, scattered like diamonds over the ocean. I stood on the porch, the breeze wrapping around me like an embrace. Somewhere far away, Sabrina was probably dialing every hospital, every friend, spinning her web of lies tighter around herself. She thought she could paint me as a helpless woman. She didn't realize I was the one holding the brush. Before going to bed, I sat by the window, writing again in my notebook. This is not running away. This is reclaiming the ground they tried to bury me under. The next morning, I woke to sunlight pouring through the window. The air smelled of sea and lemon oil from the wood polish I'd used the night before. I made breakfast: oatmeal, black coffee, simple things that tasted like independence. At 10, I called Leonard. His voice was deep, steady, the kind that had seen too many courtroom lies. "Mrs. Miles," he said, "Ruth told me everything. I've reviewed the paperwork. You have enough evidence to protect every cent of your estate. But what do you want to do with it?" "I want to build something that outlasts greed," I said. "A place where women like me can live without fear of being discarded." He was silent for a moment. "That's noble. It's necessary," I corrected. "I've spent 71 years teaching others how to stand tall. It's time I practice what I taught." He chuckled softly. "Then let's begin." After hanging up, I walked outside. The tide had come in waves, curling close to the dunes. I could almost feel Thomas beside me, his hand in mine, his voice in the wind. "Proud of you, Dot." "Not yet," I murmured. "But you will be." Far away in a house full of lies, Sabrina and Ethan were probably staring at my note, wondering how everything slipped through their fingers overnight. They didn't know this was only the beginning. I looked out at the endless sea, the light shimmering on the surface, like a promise. They had chosen deceit. I had chosen distance. And now I was going to choose destiny. The sea always told the truth. When I stepped out of the taxi, the Atlantic wind hit my face, sharp and cold, carrying the scent of salt and something older than time itself. The cottage stood half hidden behind the dunes, its blue shutters faded and sun-bleached. The paint peeled, the porch sagged, but it stood just as stubborn as I was. Thomas had bought this place decades ago when we were still living on a teacher's salary, calling it our escape hatch from the world. I had almost forgotten it existed until Ruth reminded me last week that it was still under my maiden name. Now it was mine again, a fortress, a sanctuary, and perhaps the headquarters of my revenge. Inside, dust floated like soft ghosts in the afternoon light. The air smelled of salt and old wood. Every sound felt amplified: the creak of the floorboards, the soft hum of the ocean outside. I walked from room to room, uncovering furniture draped in linen, revealing the past one piece at a time. On the kitchen counter, I found a small wooden box I didn't remember leaving behind. Inside lay a folded note in Thomas's handwriting: "Never let them take what you built." His words had followed me through decades, through betrayal, through grief, and now they felt like a commandment. I smiled faintly. "Don't worry, Thomas," I whispered. "I'm not letting anyone take anything again." By the time Ruth arrived later that afternoon, the cottage looked alive again. The windows were open, sunlight spilling in curtains, swaying gently in the wind. She parked her car beside a sleek black sedan that I didn't recognize until the driver stepped out. "Mrs. Miles," he said, offering his hand. "Leonard Burke." He was older than I expected, in his late 60s, with silver hair and an expression that seemed permanently skeptical. The kind of man who'd seen too many lies dressed up as kindness. We sat in the living room as Ruth brewed tea. Leonard opened his briefcase, spreading out folders like playing cards. "I've reviewed your situation," he said. "It's not just attempted fraud, it's premeditated elder exploitation. But if we play this right, they'll be the ones exposed." "I don't want exposure," I said. "I want control. Quiet, irreversible control." He smiled. "Then you've come to the right lawyer." He explained his plan: freeze all joint accounts, revoke any legal authorizations, and file a protection clause declaring full mental competence. If they try anything again, he said, they'll walk straight into a federal offense. Ruth leaned back in her chair. "And in the meantime," Leonard said, glancing at me, "we make her untouchable." I listened, every detail sinking in, every step measured. When he finished, I nodded slowly. "Let's make them think I'm still gone. Let them panic. I want to see how far greed will drive them." Leonard smirked. "You're not afraid they'll come after you." "I want them to," I said, "because when they do, I'll be ready." As the sun set, Ruth helped me light the fireplace. The three of us sat in its glow, the crackle of burning wood filling the silence. Leonard asked quietly, "You said this house was an investment. What else did you keep here?" I walked to the back wall and tapped a loose floorboard. It came free with a sigh, revealing a small safe embedded into the foundation. My hands trembled slightly as I turned the dial. Thomas's birthday, as always. The door opened with a familiar click. Inside were thick envelopes of deeds, stock certificates, and a single worn folder marked Hope Haven. Ruth leaned forward. "That's what you mentioned on the phone, the project you and Thomas dreamed of." I nodded, touching the cover. "We wanted to create a place where women our age could live with dignity. Not locked away, not forgotten. Somewhere that felt like home." Leonard smiled. "A noble dream." "It's more than that," I said. "It's my proof that I'm not finished." We spread the papers across the table. There were blueprints, permit drafts, financial plans, ideas long buried under life's routine. But now they looked like something waiting to be reborn. Ruth's voice softened. "You could still do it, Dorothy. You have everything you need. Land funds will." For a moment I imagined it, a building filled with laughter and purpose, not pity. Women who had been betrayed or abandoned but were still standing. "Hope Haven," I whispered. "A place where nobody feels disposable." Leonard raised his glass of tea. "To rebuilding from betrayal." I raised mine too. "To women who outlive greed." We drank, and for the first time in months I felt warmth instead of anger. After Leonard left, Ruth stayed behind. We sat on the porch watching the moon rise over the ocean. The waves shimmered silver, steady and endless. "Do you think you can really forgive them?" Ruth asked softly. "Not yet," I said. "But I can outlive them." She chuckled. "Same thing sometimes." We sat in comfortable silence, listening to the surf. Then Ruth's tone changed. "One more thing you should know, Sabrina's been busy. She called me last week pretending to check on you. She asked if you ever mentioned another property or secret accounts." I raised an eyebrow. "She called you. She thought I'd sell you out." Ruth said, her lips curling into a grin. "She forgets I helped you build your first business account." The ocean wind picked up, carrying our laughter away into the night. When she left, I locked the door and stood in the middle of the quiet house. The ticking clock was the only sound. On the desk sat the folder. For Hope Haven, its corners worn, the paper yellowed. I opened it again, tracing the plans with my fingertips. A garden for therapy. A workshop for crafts. Small apartments with ocean views. Thomas's handwriting scrawled in the margin. "Give them more than safety. Give them purpose." I whispered the words to myself. Purpose. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the ocean breathe through the cracks in the shutters. Somewhere out there my children were calling the police, crying fake tears for the mother they had tried to erase. Let them. Every false story they told would only tighten the rope around their own necks. By dawn, I was at my desk again, drafting letters. One to Leonard, authorizing him to reclaim my financial rights. Another to Ruth, entrusting her with half the Hope Haven paperwork. And a third, sealed, unsigned, addressed to Ethan and Sabrina. They wouldn't get it yet. Not until the right moment. At sunrise, I stood outside barefoot on the porch. The air was cool, briny, alive. I watched the tide roll in and thought of all the years I'd spent giving, teaching, loving, and how quickly they'd tried to make those years disappear. But I was still here. I had survived loss, illness, widowhood, and now betrayal. And like the sea, I would always come back. I looked toward the horizon, a faint smile touching my lips. "This is where it begins," I whispered. "Not revenge, rebirth." Behind me, the house creaked as if agreeing. Inside, the clock chimed 6. I picked up my pen, opened a new notebook, and wrote the first line of my new life, Dorothy Miles, founder, Hope Haven Project. The letters shimmered under the morning light. And just like that, the woman they had called confused and frail became the woman who would rewrite everything. By the time the sun rose over the dunes, the house no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like headquarters. I brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, set the mug beside the stack of documents Leonard had left, and began reading every word. Each line of legal language was a blade cutting away the control my children had tried to take. It took hours, but I didn't stop. I'd taught generations of students to never sign anything they didn't understand. I wasn't about to fail that lesson myself. Outside, the ocean glittered calm and endless. Inside, I was planning war. At noon, Leonard arrived, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his briefcase already open before he even reached the porch. "Morning, Mrs. Miles," he said with the weary confidence of a man who hadn't slept. "We have movement." He spread a few printed emails across the table. Sabrina had been busy. "Your daughter-in-law contacted 3 real estate agents," he explained. "She's pretending to be your representative, claiming you're mentally unfit, and she has authority to sell your house. All 3 have been flagged by our firm." I sipped my coffee slowly. "So she's accelerating." "Exactly. And when she realizes the banks froze your accounts this morning, she'll panic." "Good," I said. "Panic is honesty stripped of polish." Leonard smiled faintly. "You're not what I expected." "Old women never are," I said. He sat back. "You know, most of my clients cry when they realize their kids are robbing them. I've already done my crying," I told him. "Now I'm building." I showed him the folder labeled Hope Haven. He flipped through the plans, whistling softly. "You're serious about this, deadly serious." He glanced at me over the papers. "You're talking about converting this property into the first unit," I nodded. "This house has survived every storm. It's fitting." Leonard leaned forward. "If you do this, really do this, it'll mean tying your wealth to something public. It'll also mean visibility. The moment you step forward, they'll know where you are." "I want them to," I said. "Let them see what they tried to destroy." He watched me for a long moment before closing the folder carefully. "You're not running away from them, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm teaching them." After he left, I spent the afternoon walking the property. The sand was warm beneath my feet, the air heavy with salt and memory. Every step felt like reclaiming something they had tried to erase. By late afternoon, a white truck pulled into the driveway. A woman stepped out, short, sturdy, with dark skin and hair gone silver at the edges. I recognized her instantly. "Eliza," I said, smiling. She grinned, her eyes shining. "Mrs. Miles. Or should I say Dorothy Green, the mystery woman who vanished?" I laughed softly. "You kept the secret all these years. Eliza had worked for me long ago until Ethan and Sabrina fired her. You don't need help, they'd said. We'll take care of you." They hadn't asked how I'd feel about losing the only person who had known this home better than I did. "I never forgot what you told me," Eliza said, stepping into the house and setting down a grocery bag. "You said if the day ever came when your children stopped seeing you as their mother and started seeing you as their money, you'd call me back. And here we are." She looked around. Same curtains, same smell. "You didn't change a thing." "Neither did you," I said, smiling. "You still find the kitchen first." She laughed, opening cabinets, pulling out teacups, moving as if she'd never left. "I heard about what they did," she said quietly. "Sabrina called me a few months ago, asked if you had any other accounts hidden somewhere." "Of course she did," I murmured. I told her I didn't know anything. Eliza continued, setting the kettle to boil. "But I knew everything. This house, the lockbox, even your plan for Hope Haven. I've been checking in every few months just to make sure it was still standing." I blinked back tears. "You kept watch. I owed you that," she said. "You paid for my daughter's college when her scholarship fell through. You said women have to protect each other. I believed you then, and I still do." We drank tea at the old wooden table, sunlight slanting through the windows. "You're building Hope Haven again," Eliza said, not asking, just knowing. "Yes," I said. "It's time." Her smile widened. "Then you'll need help." "I can't pay you yet," I warned. I didn't ask for money. I asked for purpose, she said simply. You gave me mine once, let me return the favor. We spent the rest of the day cleaning, repairing, moving furniture. By sunset, the cottage looked less like a relic and more like a dream in progress. While Eliza scrubbed the porch, I checked my messages. There were 3 missed calls from an unknown number 1 voicemail. I played it. Mom Ethan's voice said shaky and thin. Where are you? Sabrina's losing it. The police said they can't do anything yet, but we're worried. Please just call me. You don't have to come home, but at least let us know you're okay. His voice cracked on home. I closed my eyes, remembering the boy who once followed me around the garden, his hands sticky with lemonade, his heart still soft. I deleted the message. Eliza came inside, wiping her hands on a towel. You okay? I'm fine, I said, though. Something ached deep in my chest. He's still my son, Eliza. Just lost. She nodded. People lose themselves in money faster than they lose themselves in love. That night we cooked pasta, drank cheap wine, and talked about the old days. The sound of our laughter echoed through the house, something warm and human filling the space that had been empty too long. Before bed, I walked down to the beach. The moon hung low and gold, the tide whispering secrets only the sea could keep. I took the folded note from my pocket, the one Ethan had left on my counter after dinner last week, the one that said, "We just want you to rest." I tore it in half, then into smaller and smaller pieces until the wind carried it away. When I came back inside, Eliza was already asleep in the guest room, a book resting open on her chest. I lingered in the doorway, smiling softly. It felt good to have someone who didn't see me as a problem to fix. I sat at my desk and opened my notebook again. The first page already read Hope Haven Project Phase 1. Under it I wrote, staff recruitment begins tomorrow. Secure permits. Contact local architect. Prepare press statement for Leonard. And then, almost as an afterthought, forgive when earned, not before. I closed the book, turned off the lamp, and stood by the window. The waves kept rolling, the tide, unbothered by betrayal, by money, by fear. It just kept coming back, reshaping the shore in its own quiet way. Somewhere far away, I imagined Sabrina pacing her perfect kitchen, furious that her plans had unraveled. I imagined Ethan torn between guilt and greed, between the mother he had and the life he thought he deserved. They believed I had vanished, but I hadn't disappeared. I had begun. The call came just after dawn. I was sitting on the porch with my coffee, watching gulls dive through the morning mist, when Leonard's number flashed on the screen. They filed a report, he said without preamble. Sabrina told the police you're missing and possibly senile. She's spinning a story about your confusion, saying you wandered off in the night. I took a slow sip of coffee. Let her. She's also contacted the bank again, he continued. Tried to reactivate the accounts under a temporary guardianship order. The manager flagged it. She's desperate. Desperation makes people sloppy, I said. It's useful. Leonard paused, then sighed. Dorothy, I know you're strong, but this is getting ugly. They've hired a private investigator, a man named Cole Patterson. He's good at finding or good at believing lies, both. Then let's make sure he finds what I want him to. Eliza opened the door carrying a tray of toast and jam. She caught the tone of my voice and frowned. Bad news. Expected news, I said, covering the phone's mic. They're panicking. About time. She set the tray down. What's next? I smiled. We make the panic work for us. After breakfast, Leonard drove down from Charleston with a suitcase full of papers. We spread them across the dining table, property deeds, bank statements, copies of my original will. We'll need to refile these under your maiden name, he explained. That way, if they try to search databases, they'll come up empty. And Hope Haven? I asked. He smiled. Already registered as a charitable trust in your name. I expedited the paperwork. It's legal, binding, and untouchable. Eliza clapped her hands softly. Then it's real. Yes, I said, but it's not finished until they know it's real too. Leonard leaned forward. You're planning something, I can tell. I nodded. They took my silence for weakness. So let's use that. I want them to believe the rumors that I'm lost, confused, may be gone. Let them think they've won. Then, when they're at their most comfortable, I'll remind them what I've built. He chuckled. You sound like my kind of client. By afternoon, we drafted everything, the press release for the project's anonymous donor, which of course was me, the new financial transfers, the correspondence trail to prove competence. Every detail was precise, surgical. When Leonard left, Eliza and I sat on the porch eating cold sandwiches and watching the horizon. The air felt heavy with change. "Do you ever miss them?" she asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. The truth was complicated. "I miss the idea of them," I said finally. "The people I thought they were. But those people never really existed." Eliza nodded. "Sometimes blood just means you bleed for them first." Her words settled into the salt air, heavy and true. That night, rain rolled in from the sea. I sat by the window as thunder rippled across the dark water. The power flickered once, then steadied. I pulled out my notebook and wrote down everything I'd learned about betrayal, about survival, about the quiet strength of age. Halfway through my writing, a pair of headlights swept across the front windows. A car. Then the sound of footsteps on the porch. Eliza peeked from the hallway. "Are we expecting anyone?" I shook my head and stood. The knock came sharp, professional, not hesitant. "Mrs. Miles," a man's voice called. I opened the door halfway. He stood tall, late 50s, in a tan trench coat, his face serious but kind. "Detective Cole Patterson," he said, flashing a badge. "Your daughter-in-law hired me to find you." I tilted my head. "And did she pay you to bring me back, or to make sure I stay gone?" He blinked, caught off guard. "She said you were confused, ma'am, that you might be in danger." "I am," I said softly, "but not from strangers." He hesitated, his eyes flicking past me to the house behind. "May I come in?" I stepped aside. "You might as well. The story's better with tea." Eliza served us, setting the pot down with deliberate care. Cole looked around, taking in the neat order of the cottage, the documents stacked on the table. "This doesn't look like someone who's lost her mind," he said. "That's because I'm not." He frowned. "Then why disappear?" "Because sometimes the only way to see who's pulling the strings is to cut them," I said. He studied me, then sighed, pulling out a notepad. "Can you tell me your side, off the record?" I told him everything, how they'd staged the dinner, slipped sedatives into my tea, whispered about my accounts, how I'd overheard them discussing the sale of my home. His pen stopped halfway through my story. "Elder financial abuse," he muttered. "I've seen it before, but usually the victims don't get away." "I wasn't raised to be a victim," I said. "I was raised to be a teacher. And this time the lesson is for them." He met my eyes and something shifted in his expression. Pity gave way to respect. "You have proof," I gestured to the folder on the table. "Every word, every date, every recording, even the teacup she poisoned." Cole exhaled slowly. "You're not just planning to expose them. You're planning to make them confess." "Exactly," I said. "And you, detective, are going to help me." He raised an eyebrow. "That wasn't part of the contract." "It wasn't," I said, smiling faintly, "but you're a man who hates injustice. I saw it in your eyes the moment you walked in." He chuckled. "You're manipulative. I'm thorough." Eliza returned with a plate of cookies, breaking the tension. "Detective," she said, "if you're going to help her, at least do it on a full stomach." He laughed, surprising himself. "You two are something else." "Two women who got tired of being underestimated," I said. By the time he left that night, Cole wasn't Sabrina's investigator anymore. He was mine. The next morning he called. "They're still in Savannah," he said. "Sabrina's trying to convince the bank to release the estate funds, but they won't without your signature. She's furious." "Let her burn herself out," I replied. "And tell her you found me, but that I'm resting. Let's see what kind of performance she gives when she thinks she's almost won." Cole paused. "You're setting a trap." "Exactly." After the call, I walked down to the shore, the sand cool beneath my feet. The waves rolled in steady, relentless. Above the water, the clouds broke open, letting sunlight spill through like forgiveness. I wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, but I could see the horizon of it. Somewhere beyond this storm, there would be calm again. Behind me, Eliza called from the porch, holding up the phone. "It's Ruth," she said. "She says the papers for Hope Haven are official. You're a founder now." I took the phone, hearing Ruth's laughter on the other end. "Congratulations, Dorothy. You've done it. You've built something out of betrayal." I looked out at the sea, the light dancing over the waves. "No," I said softly. "I've built something they can never touch. And in that moment, I knew the next time I faced Sabrina, I wouldn't be the one cornered. I'd be the one holding the mirror. The knock came just as the storm began. It wasn't polite or hesitant, it was firm, deliberate, the kind that carried authority. Rain streaked down the windows and thunder rolled somewhere far out over the water. Eliza froze halfway through folding laundry. I took a slow breath, smoothing the front of my sweater before opening the door. Detective Cole stood on the porch, trench coat, dripping, eyes sharp but tired. "Mrs. Miles," he said, his voice raised slightly over the rain. "We need to talk." "I thought we did that already," I said. He stepped inside before I could invite him, shaking off water. "Your daughter-in-law called me again. She's getting anxious. Said you've been spotted in Charleston. Wants confirmation. Did you give her any?" "Not yet. Depends on what you tell me." I gestured toward the kitchen. "Then come in. You might as well hear the truth before she buys a new lie." He followed me to the table where the recorder sat in plain sight beside a stack of papers. The red light blinked once. Cole noticed it, then gave a low whistle. "You recording me just in case I forget what honesty sounds like?" He smiled faintly. "Fair enough." Eliza poured tea, quiet and steady, then disappeared down the hallway, leaving us alone. Cole set his notepad down. "You've got something planned, Mrs. Miles. I can see it all over your face." "I have a lifetime of plans," I said. "But this one's special. It's about justice." He leaned back, folding his arms. "Then start from the beginning." The sound of rain filled the silence as I began. I told him about the dinner, the brochures, the sedatives, the forged signatures. I told him about the whispers at midnight, about Sabrina's voice saying, "Once she's settled, we can sell." The words poured out clean and calm, the way truth does when it's been waiting too long to be spoken. Cole didn't interrupt. His face shifted slowly from disbelief to anger to something like grief. When I finished, he rubbed his temples. "You're saying they drugged you, tried to force legal transfer." "They didn't try," I said. "They almost succeeded." "Why didn't you report it?" "Because I needed them to show who they really are. If I had called the police, then it would have been my word against theirs. They would have painted me as confused, fragile, hysterical. I've been a woman long enough to know how that story ends." He gave a bitter laugh. "You're not wrong. Besides, I said I wanted to see how far they'd go." Cole studied me for a long time. "You remind me of my mother," he said finally. "She went through something like this. My brother drained her accounts before she realized. She didn't fight back, just faded after that." "I'm sorry," I said softly. He nodded. "She would have liked you." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The storm raged outside, wind whistling through the shutters like a warning. Then I leaned forward. "Detective, I don't just want to protect what's mine. I want to make sure no one else has to go through this." Cole straightened. "You have evidence?" I slid a small folder across the table. Inside were photos, timestamps, copies of texts between Sabrina and Ethan, recordings from my phone. Every word they said, every paper they forged. He looked through them slowly, eyebrows lifting. "You kept records." "I'm a teacher. I always grade the test before giving it." A laugh escaped him despite himself. "You've got enough here to make a case for elder fraud, conspiracy, even attempted poisoning." "I don't want a case," I said. "I want a confession." He looked up sharply. "A confession, yes. On record in their own words. The law punishes, detective. I want them to understand." He frowned. "You're asking me to help trap them. I'm asking you to witness the truth." Cole exhaled, eyes scanning my face as if searching for doubt. "You realize this could get dangerous. People backed into corners don't stay civil." I smiled, small and steady. "Danger stopped frightening me the day they tried to drug me in my own kitchen." He nodded slowly. "All right, tell me what you need." Eliza returned, wiping her hands on a towel. I glanced at her. "You remember Thomas's old recorder in the drawer by the window?" she said, already moving. Cole watched as we assembled our strange little war room. The recorder went into the vase on the mantel, another mic hidden under the table. The camera lens fitted neatly behind the lace curtain. "Tomorrow," I said, "you'll call Sabrina. Tell her you found me. Tell her I'm fine but confused and that I want to sign whatever papers she mentioned. Make her believe she's won. And then she'll come here. And she'll talk. She won't be able to help herself." Greed always makes people confess, they just call it justification. Eliza handed Cole a cup of tea. You sure about this? She asked me quietly. Yes, I said. If I don't face them now, I'll be running for the rest of my life. Cole nodded. I'll make the call tomorrow morning. But if things turn ugly, you get behind me. No heroics. Detective, I said, I survived teaching middle school for 35 years. You think a liar with a designer handbag scares me? He laughed, shaking his head. You really are something. When he left, the storm had eased to a drizzle. The sound of rain on the roof became almost soothing. Eliza sat across from me, folding her hands. Do you think he'll actually help? He already has, I said. He just doesn't know it yet. We stayed up late planning. Every detail mattered: the placement of the chairs, the timing of the email, the tone of my voice when I invited them. By midnight, everything was set. Before bed, I stood by the window watching the sea. The tide had risen, high waves crashing closer than before. The smell of salt filled the air, sharp and alive. Eliza touched my shoulder. You're not sleeping tonight, are you? Not yet, I said. There's too much to remember. She nodded and left quietly, the floor creaking under her steps. When the house fell silent, I turned on the small lamp and opened my journal. The page was blank, waiting. Tomorrow they'll come thinking they can win, but I have the only weapon: they don't understand truth. I closed the book, placed it beside the recorder, and took one last look around the room. Everything was in its place: the tea set on the counter, the folder on the table, the soft hum of the recorder's red light blinking patiently in the dark. Outside, thunder rumbled, once more distant but certain. They think they know who I am, I whispered to the storm. Tomorrow they'll meet who I've become. And as lightning flashed over the waves, I could almost hear Thomas's voice in the wind. Show them, Dot. Show them what strength looks like. I smiled. I will. The wind howled around the cottage like a warning. At exactly 10 o'clock, the sound of tires crunched against the gravel outside. Through the lace curtains, I saw Sabrina's beige coat glint under the gray light. Ethan followed a few steps behind, shoulders hunched, face pale. They looked like trespassers at a graveyard. Ruth whispered from the kitchen, "They're here." I nodded, once my hands steady on the cup of tea I wasn't drinking. On the coffee table, the small recorder blinked its red light like a heartbeat. The front door opened without a knock. Mother, Sabrina said with a trembling laugh, her voice sticky with false warmth. "You had us worried sick." I'm sure I said evenly, "Come in, let's talk about family." She froze for a second, sensing the edge beneath my tone, then forced a smile. "You look, well, thank God. We've been calling everywhere. The police were ready to file a missing persons report." Ethan hovered near the door, avoiding my eyes. His hands fidgeted at his sides. "I'm touched," I said. "You must have been so worried about your inheritance." Sabrina blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me, Sid," I said simply. They obeyed without argument. The rain outside had quieted, but the tension inside was a storm of its own. I poured tea into the cup, sliding one across to Sabrina. She didn't touch it. "You found me," I said softly. "How resourceful." "Did Detective Cole tell you where I was?" Her lips parted, then tightened. "He may have mentioned you were safe. You know, he was just doing his job." "Of course," I said. "And so are you." Sabrina tilted her head, pretending not to understand. "My job, managing assets, restructuring accounts, selling properties that aren't yours." Ethan flinched. I smiled faintly. "You're very efficient at it." "I don't know what you're talking about," she said too quickly. "Then allow me to refresh your memory." I reached into the drawer beside me and laid a folder on the table. Copies of the forged power of attorney, bank statements, screenshots of her emails to the realtor, her own words in black and white. The color drained from her face. "Forgery isn't love, Sabrina," I said. "It's theft." She tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "This is absurd. You've been confused for months, Mother. You don't even know what you've signed." Or I raised my hand. "Enough." Ethan started to speak, but his voice cracked. "Mom, we didn't mean to hurt you. We just thought—" "You thought I wouldn't notice," I said sharply. "That I was too old, too tired, too kind." Silence filled the room, heavy as thunder. In the corner, Cole stepped out from behind the curtain, his voice calm but firm. "I think it's time you both stop pretending." Sabrina's head snapped toward him. "You, what are you doing here?" "Finishing my investigation," he said. "Turns out your missing person wasn't missing at all. She was being hunted. You set me up," she hissed. Cole didn't flinch. "No. You set yourself up." Ethan sank into the couch, eyes darting between us. We just wanted to make sure she was okay. "By taking her signature," Cole asked. "By selling her home," Sabrina's voice rose. "She's unstable. You said she could get lost out here." "She's a lot of things," Cole said, "but unstable isn't one of them." The air crackled. The rain began again, tapping against the windows in a steady rhythm. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "You both planned this beautifully," I said. "The fake concerned the papers, even the pills. But you made one mistake." Sabrina's lip trembled. "What mistake?" "You underestimated your teacher." Cole pressed a button on his phone. The recording began to play, the sound of Sabrina's voice filling the room unmistakable. "The realtor says we can get 650, maybe 7 once she's moved," she'd whispered. And the account, Ethan's voice followed, smaller, nervous. "Already drafted. When she signs, it's done." The room froze. Ethan covered his face with his hands. "Oh God." Sabrina lunged toward the phone, but Cole stepped between us. "Don't," he warned. Her mask finally cracked. "You don't understand," she spat. "We were drowning in debt. You wouldn't help us. I helped you your entire lives," I said. "You wanted more. You wanted mine." Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't of remorse. They were rage diluted by defeat. "You can't prove anything. This is entrapment." Cole smiled grimly. "Everything you just said is being recorded." Sabrina turned to Ethan. "Say something." But Ethan only whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom. It wasn't an excuse. It was surrender." For a moment, I almost pitied him. The boy who had once brought me wildflowers after school now sat slumped before me, hollowed out by greed and shame. Sabrina stood suddenly, her chair scraping the floor. "You'll regret this," she hissed. "You'll die alone in this rotten house, and we'll get everything anyway." I rose slowly, meeting her gaze. "Maybe. But you'll live knowing you tried and failed to steal from the woman who gave you everything. And that will haunt you far longer than death will haunt me." The rain thundered harder now, as if punctuating every word. Cole motioned for them to sit. "You're not going anywhere until we're finished." Ruth entered from the kitchen holding another folder. "These are copies of the documents you tried to file, notarized and time-stamped. We have everything." Sabrina looked ready to scream. Instead, she slumped back down, staring at her trembling hands. I took a deep breath, letting the quiet stretch. "I'm not pressing charges. Not yet." Ethan lifted his head, eyes red. "What you heard me," I said. "You want redemption, earn it." Sabrina sneered. "You think we'll beg?" "No," I said softly. "You'll work." Cole arched an eyebrow but said nothing. I leaned closer to them both. "There's a project I'm building. Hope Haven. A place for women like me, women who were betrayed by family, by society, by time. You want forgiveness. You'll help build it. Brick by brick. 5 years. Unpaid." Ethan stared at me. That's insane." "Justice often is." Sabrina crossed her arms. "And if we refuse," Cole answered before I could, "then I take this recording to the district attorney in the morning. Fraud, coercion, attempted financial abuse. You'll both go to prison." The thunder rolled again, closer this time. No one spoke. Finally, Sabrina whispered, "You wouldn't." I smiled faintly. "I already did worse. I raised you better." For a long minute, only the sound of rain filled the silence. Then Ethan spoke, his voice barely audible. "We'll do it. We'll work." Sabrina turned on him. "Are you crazy?" He looked at her, and for the first time in years I saw my son, not the man she had twisted, but the boy who used to believe in right and wrong. "No," he said quietly. "I'm done being this." She stared at him, mouth open, but no words came. Cole closed his folder, his tone final. "Then we're done here for tonight." Sabrina rose, shoulders rigid, and walked to the door without another word. Ethan followed, pausing only once to look back. His lips trembled as if he wanted to speak, but he didn't. He just nodded. When the door closed, the storm outside began to ease. The silence afterward was heavy but clean, like the air after lightning. Ruth exhaled. "Well, she said that was biblical." Cole turned to me. "You think they'll come tomorrow?" Oh, they'll come, I said. They always come when guilt has nowhere else to go. He smiled faintly. You know, Mrs. Miles, I've seen a lot in my years, but this might be the first time justice actually feels poetic. Justice, I said, staring out the window at the rain-slicked road, was never about punishment. It's about memory. And as the waves crashed against the shore, I whispered to the night, tomorrow they'll remember who taught them what love was supposed to mean. The storm passed, but the house still smelled of rain and revelation. Sabrina and Ethan returned the next morning. Their clothes were wrinkled, their eyes red from a sleepless night. They didn't knock this time. They just stood in the doorway like schoolchildren waiting for detention to begin. Come in, I said, pouring coffee into 3 mismatched cups. We might as well start this like civilized people. Sabrina sat arms crossed tight against her chest. Ethan's hands shook when he reached for his cup. I noticed how his wedding ring was missing. Cole leaned against the wall, silent, watching. Ruth sat by the window with her notepad ready to record anything necessary. So I said after a moment, "How was the night's sleep?" Well, no one answered. The air hummed with tension. Finally, Ethan whispered. We talked. I can imagine. I stirred my coffee. And what did you decide? He looked up, guilt carved deep in the lines of his face. We'll do it. We'll work. We'll earn back what we broke. Sabrina shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass, but she didn't speak. Her silence was louder than any argument. Good, I said simply. Then we understand each other. Sabrina finally snapped. You think this makes you noble. You think humiliating us is some kind of lesson. This isn't humiliation, I said. It's consequence. There's a difference. She laughed bitterly. You're enjoying this. I met her glare evenly. Not as much as you enjoyed counting my money. Cole cleared his throat, stepping forward. I'll handle the paperwork for the volunteer contracts. We'll make it official under the Hope Haven Trust. 1 year of labor renewable by Mrs. Miles's discretion. Sabrina scoffed. You sound like you're enjoying this too. I enjoy justice, he said flatly. Ruth closed her notebook. You should thank her. Most people in your position would be in handcuffs right now. Sabrina turned toward me. Why not press charges then? Why not end it cleanly? I looked at her for a long time. Because ending it wouldn't teach you anything. But living with the weight of your choices just might. Ethan lowered his gaze. You don't have to. I do, I said softly. Because if I let this go without meaning, it'll haunt all of us. The silence that followed was deep, fragile. Sabrina stared at the steam rising from her coffee. You don't understand, she murmured. We were drowning in bills. Ethan lost his job. The house was about to go into foreclosure. I didn't know what else to do. You could have asked, I said. You would have said no. Maybe I admitted. But at least that no would have been honest. Instead, you chose theft wrapped in kindness. Tears filled her eyes. She looked smaller now, like a woman stripped of her armor. I just wanted a life that didn't feel like failure. Then maybe now you'll build one that isn't stolen, I said quietly. Ethan swallowed hard. Mom, I was wrong. I let her talk me into things, but I didn't stop her either. I thought I was protecting her, but I was just afraid of losing everything. You already lost what mattered most, I said. Your integrity, your peace, but you can still earn them back. He nodded, his jaw trembling. We'll start whenever you say. Tomorrow, I said. 8 o'clock. Hope Haven site in Charleston. Bring clothes you don't mind ruining. Sabrina's head jerked up. Manual labor justice isn't paperwork, I said. It's sweat. Cole smiled faintly. You heard the lady. Sabrina's mouth opened, but no words came. She stared at me for a long moment, then looked away. When they finally left, the house felt lighter. Ruth let out a slow breath. Do you think they'll actually show up? They will, I said. Fear of prison is a great motivator. Cole chuckled. You really think this'll change them? I don't know, I admitted. But it'll change me. I'm tired of surviving. It's time to teach. That night the storm clouds scattered, revealing a clear sky. Eliza made soup, humming an old tune. I sat by the window, the ocean silver in the moonlight. For the first time in months, the air didn't taste like betrayal. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer. It was Leonard. News travels fast, he said. The family story about your disappearance fell apart. The police closed the case. You're officially not missing anymore. Perfect, I said, because I'm finally found. He laughed softly. You really pulled this off, Dorothy. What now? Now I rebuild. And they learn. After hanging up, I opened my notebook. The first line of a new page read, "Forgiveness begins when anger learns to breathe." I stared at it for a long time. Eliza walked in quietly. You did what you had to do, she said. You didn't destroy them. You gave them a chance. Maybe, I said. Or maybe I gave myself one. She sat beside me, patting my hand. You still love them. I smiled sadly. That's the problem, isn't it? The next morning the air was clear, the sea calm again. I woke early, unable to shake the restlessness inside me. I made coffee, then went for a walk along the beach. Each step left prints that the tide immediately erased. I thought about time, how it does the same thing to pain if you let it. By the time I returned to the cottage, I knew what I had to do. On the kitchen table, I left 3 envelopes, one for Ruth, one for Leonard, one for myself. Inside mine, I wrote a promise. I will not let revenge harden me. I will let it guide me to something worth forgiving. At 9, Cole called. They're driving up now. Sabrina looks like she hasn't slept in days. Good, I said. Neither did I when they poisoned my tea. He hesitated. You sure you don't want me there when they arrive? No, I said. This part's mine. When they stepped out of the car, I was already waiting by the porch. Arms crossed the morning light behind me. Sabrina's hair was pulled back tight, her face stripped of makeup. Ethan carried a duffel bag. They looked nothing like the polished couple who had once pitied my age. You came, I said simply. Ethan nodded. We said we would. Sabrina looked away. Let's just get this over with. I handed them gloves and pointed toward the back garden where the ground waited to be tilled for the Hope Haven flower beds. Start there. We'll talk later. They hesitated, then began working. The sound of shovels hitting earth filled the air, awkward and uneven, at first then steady. From the porch I watched them under the morning sun, 2 figures bent over soil trying to bury their guilt, one scoop at a time. Eliza brought me lemonade. Feels strange, doesn't it, she said. What does seeing punishment turn into purpose? I nodded. It's the only way it ever really works. Hours passed. The flower beds took shape, and for the first time I saw something almost human flicker across Sabrina's face. Not pride, not defiance, just exhaustion touched with humility. By evening, when they finally stopped, their hands were blistered and their clothes streaked with dirt. They looked at me, waiting for judgment. Tomorrow, I said quietly, we start again. Sabrina frowned. You mean this isn't over? It's only just begun. When they left, driving away in silence, I turned to Eliza. Do you think people can really change? She thought for a moment. Sometimes. But not because they want to. Because they have to. That night I sat alone on the porch, the stars bright and countless above me. The waves whispered against the shore, steady as truth. For the first time I didn't feel angry. I felt free. Tomorrow would bring work, maybe progress, maybe more disappointment. But tonight I let myself rest in the space between justice and grace. The air smelled of salt and forgiveness waiting to be earned. The first week was chaos wrapped in silence. Sabrina and Ethan showed up each morning at 7:30 sharp, too afraid to be late, but too proud to look me in the eye. They worked separately at first, Sabrina in the kitchen scrubbing pots with a bitterness that could have stripped paint, Ethan outside hauling bricks and soil under the supervision of the construction crew. I said nothing. Some lessons only grow in silence. By the 3rd day, the heat had settled like judgment. The humidity clung to the air, heavy as memory. From my office window, I watched them labor under the Charleston sun, their bodies bending and lifting their clothes stained with sweat and clay. For the first time in their lives, they were building something that couldn't be bought. At lunch, I joined them under the shade of an unfinished pergola. Sabrina was wiping her forehead with the back of her arm, her nails chipped and hands blistered. Ethan sat beside her, staring at the ground. Eat, I said, setting down a basket of sandwiches. The body won't forgive what pride starves. Ethan nodded and reached for one. Sabrina hesitated, then sighed and took a bite. How long are we doing this? She asked, not looking at me. 5 years, I said. She snorted softly. If I last 5 weeks, it'll be a miracle. Then pray for one, I replied. Ethan laughed under his breath. You know she's not used to people talking to her like that. Neither are you, I said, smiling faintly. Something shifted in the air. For the first time since their betrayal, I saw a flicker of humor in their eyes. Not defiance, not manipulation, but something human trying to climb back through the wreckage. That night I found a note on my porch table written in Ethan's familiar handwriting. Mom, I know saying sorry isn't enough. But today, when I saw those women thanking you for this place, I realized I've never built anything that mattered. Maybe it's time I start. I folded the note carefully and tucked it inside my journal. The following week brought rain, thick, steady, relentless. Most of the work had to stop, but Sabrina came knocking anyway. Her clothes were soaked through her hair, plastered to her face. Kitchen roof's leaking, she said breathlessly. I figured you'd want to know. I looked at her dripping on my doorstep, exhausted but sincere. Come in, I said. She followed me inside, shivering slightly. I handed her a towel and poured tea. I never realized how much this place means to people, she murmured after a while. Today I saw two women helping another walk down the hall, arm in arm like sisters. One of them told me she hasn't felt useful in years. Feeling useful, I said softly, is sometimes the beginning of healing. She nodded, staring into her cup. I don't know if I deserve to heal. You don't, I said, but neither did I deserve to lose everything I built. And yet here we are, still breathing. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't look away. You're tougher than I gave you credit for. You're weaker than you thought you were, I said. That's what makes you human. Sabrina exhaled shakily, setting her cup down. Thank you for not destroying us. I smiled faintly. Oh, make no mistake. I destroyed the people you were. But what comes next, that's on you. When she left that night, I stood by the window and watched her cross the courtyard, her figure small against the glow of the security lights. She didn't look back. That was a good sign. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. Slowly, imperceptibly, change began to take root. Ethan organized the storage room, labeling every tool and inventory sheet with precision. Sabrina suggested adding a small garden outside the residents' dining room, saying they need something alive to look at when they eat. I approved it quietly, pretending to resist. In truth, I was proud. By midsummer, the first flowers were blooming, marigolds, lavender, and roses, each planted by the hands that once tried to take everything from me. Eliza noticed it too. You've softened, she teased one afternoon as we walked along the new garden path. I've learned, I said. Softness isn't weakness when you choose it. The transformation wasn't fast or clean. There were still bad days, arguments between them, moments of frustration when pride resurfaced like rust under fresh paint. Once Sabrina threw down her gloves and shouted, I'll never be good enough for you. And I answered simply, then stop trying to be good enough for me. Be better for yourself. That was the day she didn't come back inside for lunch, but returned the next morning without a word, her eyes swollen but clearer. By autumn, Hope Haven had begun to take its true shape. The main building's renovations were nearly finished. The therapy rooms painted, the community hall ready for its first group session. The women who lived there started calling it the haven that heals. One morning I caught Ethan standing at the top of the new staircase, looking down at the residents below. Beautiful, isn't it? I said, stepping beside him. He nodded slowly. Yeah, it feels different. Like the place itself forgives you while you work. I looked at him, really seeing him for the first time in years, the worry lines, the humility in his stance. He wasn't the son who betrayed me anymore. He was the man who was learning how to rebuild without taking. Later that day, Sabrina approached me with a folder. These are the updated menus, she said. Healthier, cheaper, and the residents actually like them. I flipped through the pages. You've done well. Her smile faltered. You mean that I wouldn't say it if I didn't? She exhaled, her shoulders easing for the first time. You know, I used to think this was punishment, but now it feels like therapy. That's the trick about justice, I said. When it works, it heals both sides. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the common room, the smell of fresh paint and blooming jasmine filling the air. I looked around at the tables, the laughter echoing faintly from the residents' rooms, the quiet hum of life restored. 5 months ago, this had been nothing but a blueprint and a revenge plan. Now it was alive, something larger than my anger, something that belonged to all of us. When Cole stopped by later to check on the site, he found me sitting there in the dim light. You look tired, he said gently. I look free, I corrected. He smiled. They're changing. You know that, right? Yes, I said. And so am I. Cole leaned against the doorway. So what happens when the 5 years are up? I don't know, I said honestly. Maybe I'll give them their inheritance back. Maybe I won't. Maybe they'll stop caring about it. You think that's possible? I smiled faintly. I think redemption isn't about getting what you want. It's about no longer needing it. He nodded slowly. Then I'd say you've already won. When he left, I stepped outside. The moon hung low over the garden, lighting every petal the way forgiveness lights old, wounds soft, steady, patient. In the distance, I could hear Sabrina laughing at something Ethan said. Real laughter, not the brittle kind that once covered lies. And I realized then that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the ending of our story. It was the middle of a miracle I hadn't dared to hope for. The kind of miracle that grows in soil watered by tears. By the end of the 4th year, Hope Haven no longer felt like a construction site or a punishment. It felt like a heartbeat. Every morning the halls filled with the sound of voices, women greeting each other, laughter echoing through corridors that once smelled of fresh paint and now smelled like life. The therapy rooms buzzed with activity, and the small cafe Sabrina had designed for the residents was finally open. She called it Second Cup, and every mug had the words "Still Here" etched on its rim. That phrase caught on. The residents started using it as a greeting. When someone asked, "How are you today?" they would smile and say, "Still here." I loved that. Ethan spent his days running the maintenance department, but he had started something else on his own. A Skillshare program, he called it, where residents taught each other old crafts, quilting, pottery, even bookkeeping. He said it reminded them that knowledge doesn't expire with age. One morning, as I was reviewing invoices in my office, Sabrina knocked softly. She looked different now, hair streaked with silver, face calm, confident. The girl who once whispered about my assets now spoke with purpose. "May I come in?" she asked. "Of course," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. "You never have to ask." She sat clutching a file. "I wanted to show you something. It's about the new residence outreach plan." I took the papers, scanning them. Her handwriting filled every margin with notes and ideas. "You've put thought into this," I said. "I've lived it," she replied. "These women aren't statistics. They're just us 20 years later." For a moment her voice cracked, but she steadied herself. "I've been thinking about something, Dorothy. When you first brought me here, I was angry. I thought you were cruel. But now I see you gave me the life I didn't deserve." I looked at her carefully. "You built this life, Sabrina. I only gave you the ground." She smiled faintly. "Then, I guess we finally understand each other." There was a long, quiet pause. Then she asked, "Do you think Ethan's ready for what? For forgiveness?" I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. "He already has it. He just hasn't forgiven himself yet." That afternoon I found Ethan in the garden repairing the fountain by the rose beds. He looked up when he saw me and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't need words. "The pump's fixed," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Good," I said, then paused. "You've done well here, Ethan." He laughed softly. "You know, I used to dread coming to work. Now it's the only place I feel right. Because it's honest work," he nodded. "Because it's meaningful." We stood in silence for a moment, watching the water bubble and fall. Then he said, "Mom, I want to ask you something." "Go ahead." "If you had to do it all over again, the dinner, the pills disappearing, would you still do it?" I thought about it. About the fear, the loneliness, the anger that once kept me awake at night. And then I thought about this Hope Haven, the gardens, the laughter, the woman Sabrina had become, the man Ethan was becoming. "Yes," I said finally. "Every painful second." He nodded as if he'd been waiting for that answer. I figured. As the weeks passed, the 5th year drew near. Cole visited often, still half detective, half friend. One evening he found me sitting on the porch with Eliza. "You've built something rare," he said, looking out over the property. "A story that ends well." I smiled. "You don't believe in happy endings, do you, Cole?" He chuckled. "Not usually. But this isn't a happy ending. It's justice with flowers." Eliza laughed. "I'll drink to that." We shared lemonade as the sun sank into the horizon. The air smelled of honeysuckle and rain. I couldn't help but think of Thomas then, how proud he would have been to see what his stubborn wife had done. The next day Ruth came running into my office, her face glowing. Dorothy, you won't believe it. The first Hope Haven branch in Georgia got its funding approved. I stood up stunned. Already, she nodded, handing me the letter. They want to name it after you. The Miles Center for Women's Renewal. For the first time in years, tears filled my eyes, unbidden and warm. I didn't build this for my name, I said softly. I know, Ruth said. That's why you deserve it. Later that night, I called a staff meeting in the main hall. The residents gathered, too curious and buzzing with excitement. When I announced the news, the room erupted in applause and tears. Sabrina hugged Ethan, and he actually lifted her off the ground. For a heartbeat, they looked like the young couple I'd first met before greed, before betrayal. Only this time they were better, wiser, real. After the meeting, I found myself walking through the hallways alone, running my hand over the walls, the freshly framed photos, the laughter spilling from the recreation room. Every brick of this place carried a piece of the woman I had been, the one they'd called confused, fragile, disposable. That woman was gone. The next morning I met with Leonard to finalize a new will. He raised an eyebrow when he read it. "You're leaving everything to the Hope Haven network?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Every penny, every property, every share. My children will have what truly matters, the work they've built." He smiled. "You've changed them, Dorothy." "No," I said. "I reminded them who they were before greed taught them fear." That evening I walked into the dining hall just as dinner was being served. Sabrina was helping an elderly resident carry her tray. Ethan was adjusting the thermostat for one of the rooms. They didn't see me, but I stood there watching. It hit me suddenly how small the world can feel when it's filled with gratitude. After dinner, they joined me on the porch. The air was cool and the cicadas hummed in the distance. "Do you remember," I asked, "the first night you came here?" Sabrina groaned softly. "How could we forget? I thought you were insane." And now she smiled. "Now I think you saved us." Ethan nodded. "You did, Mom." I looked at them both and said, "No. You saved yourselves. I just refused to give up on you." The three of us sat there for a long time saying nothing. The stars came out one by one, bright and forgiving. In that silence, I realized something I hadn't before. Revenge had never been the end of my story. It had only been the door I had to walk through to reach redemption. When the wind shifted, carrying the scent of roses from the garden, I closed my eyes and whispered a quiet thank you to Thomas, to Eliza, to the women of Hope Haven, to the version of myself who had once been brave enough to disappear. And in that moment I knew I had finally come home. The ocean was quiet that evening, as if even the waves had decided to listen. I sat at my desk by the window, the same one where I had written every plan, every letter, every decision that had brought me here. The air was thick with salt and jasmine from the garden below. Hope Haven shimmered in the distance, its windows glowing gold under the setting sunday. Women laughed somewhere down the path, their voices drifting up like music. I uncapped my fountain pen, the same one Thomas had given me on our 20th anniversary, and began to write. "To every woman who has been silenced, forgotten, or betrayed, this is for you. You are not too old to fight back, not too tired to rebuild, and never too late to begin again." The words flowed easily, now unburdened. I paused to look outside. The garden below was alive with color. I could see Sabrina helping one of the older residents prune roses, her hands gentle, her eyes softer than I ever remembered them. A few yards away, Ethan was fixing a garden light, laughing with two women from the rehabilitation wing. If someone had told me 5 years ago that the same hands that signed my betrayal would one day plant roses in my name, I would have called it madness. Now it felt like peace. A knock came at the door. "Come in," I said. Eliza entered holding 2 cups of tea. "I thought you might need this," she said, setting one beside me. I smiled. "Still know my taste." "I always did," she said. Then with that warm, knowing look, "Are you writing the speech more like a goodbye?" I said quietly. "The foundation launches tomorrow. After that, Hope Haven won't need me every day. It'll have its own life." Eliza sat across from me, her hands folded. "You know you built more than a home here. You built a revolution." I laughed softly. "One garden bed and leaky roof at a time." She smiled. "That's how revolutions start." We drank in silence for a while. Outside, the women were gathering under the gazebo for the evening choir. Their voices rose like prayer, old gospel hymns and lullabies woven together by time and gratitude. When Eliza left, I returned to the letter. They said aging meant fading. They said forgiveness meant surrender. But aging is only another word for becoming, and forgiveness is the highest form of rebellion. You can reclaim your life, your story, your name, and no one can stop you once you do. I signed it simply Dorothy Miles. The paper trembled slightly under my fingers, not from weakness, but from the weight of everything it carried. Later that night, Sabrina knocked on the door. She didn't enter until I nodded. "You're still awake," she said. "So are you," I replied. "Is something wrong?" She shook her head. "No, I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" "For not sending me to prison. For giving me a chance to become someone else." I looked at her, really looked. Gone was the polished mask of the woman who once tried to bury me in silk and sedation. The person standing before me was quieter, humbler, her voice stripped of vanity. "You didn't become someone else, Sabrina," I said. "You finally met yourself." She blinked back tears. "I still don't know if I deserve forgiveness." "You don't earn forgiveness," I said gently. "You live it." She nodded, biting her lip. "The women here, they trust me now. They tell me things they've never told anyone. I think, no, I know this place is saving them. That's why we built it," I said, "so no one ever feels worthless again." Sabrina hesitated at the door. "You should rest, Dorothy. Big day tomorrow." "I will," I said. "Good night, dear." When she was gone, I sat for a long time staring at the light flickering under the door. I thought of all the nights I had spent awake in fear, in anger, in despair. Now I stayed awake because I couldn't bear to miss a single moment of peace. The next morning, the world was bright and new. The courtyard overflowed with flowers, the walls freshly painted, the women bustling like bees, preparing for a celebration. Leonard had arrived early, his tie crooked as usual. Ruth stood beside him, clipboard in hand, pretending not to tear up every few minutes. "Dorothy," Leonard said, handing me a stack of papers. "All the legal work is done. You're officially retired from everything except being legendary." I chuckled. "I think I'll manage." The ceremony began just after noon. Reporters gathered under the awning, cameras clicking. The ribbon stretched across the new wing of the building, where a plaque read, "The Hope Haven Network, founded by Dorothy L. Miles." As I stepped up to the podium, a hush fell. Dozens of women sat in folding chairs, some in wheelchairs, some with canes, some holding hands. And behind them, Sabrina, Ethan, Eliza, Ruth, and Leonard, my strange little family built from the ruins of betrayal. I took a breath and began. 5 years ago, I was told I needed to be taken care of, that I was too old to make my own choices, that my best years were behind me. But today I stand here to tell you there are no best years. There are only the years you decide to make your own. Applause rippled through the crowd. I smiled, feeling the warmth of it settle deep inside. This place, I continued, was born out of pain, out of greed and heartbreak and loss. But pain, if you listen closely, can teach you where to build. And we have built something that will outlive all of us. Sabrina wiped a tear. Ethan bowed his head. I paused, looking out over the sea of faces. Hope Haven is not a charity. It's a promise that no woman will ever be discarded again. That no mother, wife, teacher, or dreamer will ever be told her time is over. Because as long as we can breathe, we can rebuild. The crowd rose to their feet, clapping, crying, shouting my name. It felt less like a victory and more like a release. When the ceremony ended, the women surrounded me, hugging, thanking, blessing. I could feel Thomas's spirit somewhere in that crowd, smiling as he always did when a plan worked out better than either of us expected. That evening, after everyone had gone, I returned to my office one last time. The desk was bare except for the letter I'd written the night before. I folded it carefully, slipped it into an envelope marked "For the Next Generation," and placed it in the drawer. Outside, the sky blazed pink and gold. Sabrina and Ethan stood at the garden gate watching the sunset together. They didn't see me, but that was all right. Some things didn't need witnesses. I walked down the hall, past the rooms, filled with laughter, the soft hum of life returning. Every door I passed whispered a story, women who had been forgotten now remembered. Women who had been invisible now seen. When I stepped outside, the sea air met me like an embrace. The waves glittered under the first stars. I thought of the woman I had been, the one sitting at that restaurant years ago listening to lies wrapped in love, and smiled. She had disappeared. and in her place stood someone new. I whispered to the ocean, "You were right, Thomas. Dignity isn't inherited. It's rebuilt." Then I turned back toward the glowing lights of Hope Haven, the laughter of women rising into the night. And if my story finds someone out there, someone standing at the edge of their own storm, I hope they'll remember this. It's never too late to start again. If you've ever been underestimated, betrayed, or forgotten, share your story below. Someone out there needs to hear it. Because every storm leaves behind the materials to build something new, something like hope.